Today's online presentation focuses on the politics of New Brunswick, featuring insights from Dr. Mario Levesque from the province of New Brunswick and the University, Mount Allison University. He's an assistant prof in the Politics and International Relations department there at Mount Allison. His teaching and research focuses on public policy analysis and public administration, largely within the Canadian context. His research examines relationships between variations in governance arrangements and changes in public policy in order to elaborate strategies for public policy change. Previously, he worked in the environmental sector and has served on various environmental industry associations. We're very lucky to have Dr. Levesque here with us tonight, and I just remind our audience, they're tuning in live or afterwards, please feel free to visit our blog, provincialpolitics.blogspot.ca, where you'll be able to join in the discussion. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Mario. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jared, and thank you for inviting me, and welcome to all the people that are tuning into this broadcast, actually. I've got a few things I'd like to touch on tonight, and I think I'm going to couch it in a couple of themes overall. The first theme is subservience, the second theme is maritime union, and then the third theme that I'm going to touch on is the provincial election coming up in 2 months here in New Brunswick. But first, I just want to say a couple things to encourage all the people taking the courses, actually, to, if you ever get the opportunity, and I'm just touching on this because I've had this happen to me in my own career, and that is to move around the country a little bit. You'll get a very, very different perspective on the politics of the country as you move around. I started in central Canada in Ontario, moved over to Newfoundland for a little while, and then now I'm in New Brunswick. And I hope that I can, again, move around in the future, maybe as a visiting professor to a university in Western Canada. But you really, really get a different idea of the political culture of the different regions within Canada. So on that, I would really encourage you as a student and or even in your work life, if you do have an opportunity to move around. Now, basically for today, I want to take a look at a couple things. As you can likely see, in terms of, I've got a little PowerPoint here with just 5 or 6 slides overall for us to take a peek at, but I've got it set up in a particular way, and that is we have the provincial flag in the center of the screen that you should be able to see, and on top of it I've got 2 multinational companies that are homegrown New Brunswick companies. That's Irving and McCain. And I've got them on top of the New Brunswick flag because for a particular reason. I've done that on purpose simply to let you know that they basically control the province. The 2 multinational companies, whatever they wish to have done, the province basically turns around and does implement in one way or another over a short period of time. So this ties into the theme of subservience here is what I was getting at overall. Now, in just taking a look at this, I'm going to cover a few things in here, and political culture, political economy, political cleavages, the electoral system, party system, political attitudes overall, but I'm not going to per se do them in that particular order. I'm going to cover them within the theme of subservience, and you'll get in just 1 second a little bit to know what I mean about it. Thinking about subservience, there's 3 main points I want to get across to you when you think about New Brunswick politics. First, right off the top, in terms of geographic size and population-wise, New Brunswick is about 1/10 the size of the province of Alberta, a little bit about, I think, 12% of what Saskatchewan is or something like that. Much smaller yet than Ontario and or Quebec. So very, very small in comparison to the western provinces and central Canadian provinces. Second is the fact that we're also very, very small in terms of population size, only about 750,000 people. So that's quite small in terms of population, and it's concentrated in its 3 main urban centers, and that's Fredericton, St. John, and also in the Moncton area, or the Moncton-Dieppe-Shediac area. And it's interesting because New Brunswick is officially bilingual. And if you take a look at this chart up here, in the graphics that I've shown you here, it's about a 2/3 English, 1/3 Francophone or French set of citizens. And that has stayed consistent since the 1970s right up to 2011. It has not changed very much at all, and even the home language has really not changed overall. I bring this up because this is a huge, forms a huge underpinning to the subservience theme overall. Now, if you remember nothing after today, when you go back, remember this next slide that I'm about to show you, and it'll go a long way to helping you understand New Brunswick politics. And that is essentially right here. So we have the province of New Brunswick in here, and from here, what you're taking a peek at, you can see St. John down here. There's the capital here, Fredericton, and then Moncton, Shediac, Dieppe is all over here in the southeastern portion. Now, to understand New Brunswick politics, think about it this way. Draw a diagonal line from the northwest down to the southeast, so from Grand Falls and Edmundston up in the northwest down to Moncton and Sackville. Anything northeast of that line is Francophone Acadian population predominantly. Anything southwest of that line is predominantly Anglophone based on the United Empire Loyalists that came up. This is significant because this ties right into our political culture here in the province. It ties into our economic structure, and so it has very, very deep ties into what the province is and its identity, right down to the type of services that we provide to the different regions. And let me give you an idea about this in here. And the first theme within subservience here is the English-French divide. So I'm just getting into this English-French divide right in here. And this goes back to the deportation of the Acadians back in from 1755 to about 1762. What we had was the war between France and Britain going on. The British were taking larger control. And the French that were in New Brunswick, or it wasn't called New Brunswick in those days, it was called Acadia, which also included Nova Scotia, PEI, Cape Breton, and parts of New England at the time. They eventually did win, but in winning, though, the French, they wanted the French to pledge allegiance to the British Crown, so to the Queen. The French initially rejected that, did not want to, but eventually relented. However, the British did not believe them, and they did not trust them. So that led to a deportation of the Acadians, or the French population. Of a total in New Brunswick of about 15,000 Acadians, or French people, about 12,000 got deported down to the New England states and to Louisiana as well. And by 1762, when the British had no longer saw France as a threat to them, they allowed the Acadians to come back. The only thing is, though, only about 3,000 of them came back. And you also have to ask yourself, what did they come back to? Well, they came back to a not their own farms that they used to have or anything else, because those were given to United Empire Loyalists. So they were pushed out to the periphery areas on marginal land and into the outskirts. So read right here, right on the map, the periphery northern part of the province in here. This is important in here. So all of a sudden we have this subservient French population to an English majority all the time. This permeates us to who we are today within New Brunswick, or to who the New Brunswick population is, and into the types of services that we have. So for example, we say that New Brunswick in 1982, with the patriation of our Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we had entrenched the fact that we are a bilingual province, the only bilingual province in Canada, the rest being unilingual English, or in Quebec's case, unilingual French. Now, you have to ask yourself, though, are we really bilingual overall, or is it just symbolic? And in my opinion, from my way of looking at it and thinking about it, it is largely symbolic. Yes, on paper we are bilingual. Yes, we have our laws in both official languages overall, but it's really in name only. When you get right down to it and you take a look at it, here in the province, we're running two healthcare systems, one in French, one in English. We're running two education systems, one in French, one in English. And you're seeing them, schools, side by side, one French and one English. And so kids go to one and or the other in some communities. And even for the provision of social services, we're running two different systems all the time, with the constant complaint that the Francophone side of things is always chronically underfunded. And I think the statistics bear it out that it is rightly so overall. So this English-French cleavage is significant. And it's even more significant, though, as we see the change in the population overall within the province. So remember here, Fredericton, St. John, the southeast is where the main population is. About probably half the population are in these three areas. And when we get up to the current census change over here, the CBC did a nice little graphic here, if it comes up for me. And yep, It should come up. There it is, right there. Hopefully all of you can see this. You should be seeing a bunch of green dots and a bunch of or green balloons and red balloons here. This was the change in the population from 2006 to 2011 in New Brunswick. The green balloons.
Mario.
Yep.
Mario, can you screen share that other screen that you just popped up there? Because the Google won't read it.
Sure. What do I need to do to screen share it?
So if you go off to just go back to the Google Hangouts screen, and then go back and find that green box along the left side.
Hang on one second here. Bear with me.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and then go and screen share the CBC slide that you just opened, or the window you just opened. There we go.
There it is.
Yep.
Can everybody see it now?
Yes,
okay.
sir.
Perfect. Good. Thank you. I apologize for that as well. I didn't know I had to do that. But what you should see is the green and the red balloons in this process in here. And the green balloons in here represent areas of population growth. The larger the balloon, the greater the population has grown. And the red ones represent population decline within the province. You should be noticing two trends. So one trend around Fredericton, the capital here, population growth, and in the southeast, right here, Moncton, Dieppe, and Shediac in here. St. John, not really growing that much. The second trend, which you should be seeing, is if you draw a line horizontally across, the northern part of the province is basically moving down towards the southern part of the province in here. So we're seeing a population shift within the actual province as well. So we're seeing a abandonment of the rural areas into the major urban centers, which is not anything new for most of the other parts of Canada, except for the fact that New Brunswick is kind of unique because it's a very rural province. About 50% of the population live in rural areas, and the other 50 in the three main urban centers. So this is significant here, because if you think about it from a government perspective, all of a sudden you've got to maintain your water lines, your sewer pipes, your roads, your social service provisions, your schools for your kids and everything, but you have a severely declining population in the rural areas, which means that it's very, very costly to do so. Plus, tie into the fact that you're essentially running two education systems, two healthcare systems, two systems of social services, and it becomes very, very costly overall. So that's a big challenge and goes into that English-French duality. So when we talk about it here, there's no rural-urban cleavage in New Brunswick. It's more north-south cleavage when you really talk about it in there. So I'm just going to minimize that one chart here and just pull up the PowerPoint one more time, and perfect. Okay. Now, just before getting to this particular slide here, I'm just going to minimize this right here, and there we are. What you should, so subservience, English-French divide, but there's also a second dimension to the subservience theme, and that is economic interests overall within New Brunswick. So largely what has tended to happen over time is we have the French economic interest being subservient to the English majority in terms of economic interest. And we can see this through the two large multinational corporations in New Brunswick. If you remember that first graphic I had with the McCain and the Irving sign on top of the province, that's why I did that slide that way. Nothing happens in New Brunswick politics unless the Irvings or the McCains basically want it. I mean, I won't say nothing happens, but I mean the vast majority of it happens because they approve of it or they do not approve of it. And
Mario, just to let you know, if you could go back and just one more time screen share your PowerPoint, we should be able to see it.
I don't have any slide on a particular PowerPoint for the economic interest. That's all.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay.
If you want to you can put your camera back on if you want, or
sure. Whereabouts?
Just go back to screen share and unscreen share it.
Okay, hang on one second. And there we are. How's that?
Perfect. Thanks, man.
Okay, good stuff. Technology, it's great when it works, and when you don't know it, it's kind of tough sometimes. But just with the economic interest, I was getting at actually is the fact that, think about a couple of big multinational corporations that have a monopoly on the province. So let's pick Irving here. I mean, they're homegrown, they're a success story from New Brunswick, so are the McCains, which is excellent. How much of a monopoly do they have? Well, the Irvings own the majority of all the pulp and paper mills in the province. They own the majority of the sawmills in the province. They own the trucking companies to haul the logs to the market. They also own a set of chain stores like Home Depot we have across Canada. Well, here in Atlantic Canada, there's a chain like Home Depot called Kent Building Supplies. That's Irving. That's owned by them. They have a lot of people work out in remote areas. So what did they do? Well, they built their own modular home plant in here to build modular homes and trailers for people out in remote areas. They also own a large section of the energy in industry overall. The largest oil refining plant in Canada is located in St. John, New Brunswick, and the Oil East Pipeline, we want it here in New Brunswick. Simple reason, a good portion of the population of New Brunswickers work in the oil patch right now out in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So to us, having oil and refining it here is not a big controversial issue like it is in some other regions overall. But that's Irving, though. They're the ones that control this. They have their own shipping lines. They have their own shipbuilding plants, yards in St. John and Halifax as well. They own their own railroads, their own locomotives, trains, cars, the works for that. They own their own trucking company in terms of Midland Transport. There's so much ownership that they have in there. It's just phenomenal. We can talk about their ownership of if you're going to make products, build products, well, you need to market products. They own their own marketing companies. They own 3 to 4 large daily newspapers in the province, so communications. They own I think last count I had, 19 of the community newspapers in the province as well. So they control the message that gets out to the public as well. In terms of culture, they even own a junior A hockey team, and getting back to publications, they even own the University Press of New Brunswick. So let's put it this way. If something gets harvested, trucked, marketed, sold to anyone in New Brunswick and or even the New England states, for example, chances are the Irvings have had a hand in it somewhere along the line, if not all the way along the line. I mean, they own 3,000 gas stations in the Maritimes and in the New England states. That's a significant multinational corporation, and it's a success story for New Brunswick. That's excellent. And we can talk about the McCains as well and their domination of the potato growing industry and the fast food packaging and making it in the industry as well. The challenge in this, though, is that because they're so large, it really, really makes it difficult for small companies or companies to compete with them because they just buy them out, plain and simple. So when you hear, for example, our own Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, say that there's a culture of defeatism in Atlantic Canada and it lacks innovation, I don't buy that. There's a lot of innovation in here, and there's a lot of entrepreneurship in here, and it's located in small businesses scattered throughout the periphery of the province, but most of those small businesses are all seasonal industries. As soon as they get to be more permanent year-round and get to grow a little bit to be a medium-sized business, one of the large multinational companies buys them out, Reed, Irving, or McCain's in here, just to eliminate the competition. So it's not that there's a lack of will, it's not that there's a lack of entrepreneurship, it's there. If we want to really address this idea of culture of dependency, I say we need to figure out how to break up those monopolies overall and to deal with those monopolies to foster competition. We foster competition, then we'll all of a sudden put the tools in people's hands in order to address their own futures instead of being dependent on other regions of the country. So that gets me to a subservience in here to my third point within subservience, which is subservience within Canada, New Brunswick, Canada. So New Brunswickers within the Canadian Federation. Now, for each dollar of revenue that New Brunswick obtains per year, anywhere from 32 cents to 41 cents of that dollar comes from the federal government in the form of transfer payments or equalization payments, so from Ottawa. That's a lot of money. 40% of each dollar comes from outside your region, and this is where people tend to get upset with the region and say, well, you need to do more economic activity, stimulate more, and again, you need to address those monopolies first in order to have any success, I think, on this point overall. But what happens is that we do have New Brunswick is a have less province, so it does claim equalization within this dynamic. One question that pops up in here is how does that work out within the political climate overall across Canada? Well, New Brunswick tends to be fairly readily agreeable, I would think, to whatever the agenda is of the federal government. I mean, it may put up a fuss, but not that great of a fuss. I mean, plain and simple, let's look at it this way. If you're getting 40 cents of every dollar from the federal government, you're surely not going to bite the hand that feeds you. That's pretty direct. It's pretty simple. That's just the way it goes. So the federal government can easily buy out the province for whatever it wants to do for its own particular agenda. And so again, there's a subservience within that whole dynamic in there. So that's important in there to think about. So subservience goes into the French-English divide. It's within the economic interest within the province overall, and also within New Brunswick, within the Canadian Federation. Okay, so how does this manifested itself in here? I mean, it turns around and says that from a political cultural standpoint for the province in here, we tend to think that New Brunswick is a very, very traditional type of province. It's almost sometimes socially conservative or backwards or very late to come to the table in terms of not very progressive overall. That's an argument that's been put forth. I mean, you stop and you think about it. I mean, power tends to exchange between the Conservatives and the Progressive Conservative Party of the province and the Liberal Party, usually for 2 or 3 terms between each one on a regular basis. There's one exception to that, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So there's not that much competition for from third parties, for example. So you could say it's more traditional overall. Protest parties have not really played a big factor in New Brunswick politics over the years. And before 1987, province was rife with patronage. I mean, if one government came in and won an election in the 70s, well, all the people that got the paving contracts were of that particular government stripe. It was that simple, and that was very, very evident. So that's the argument going forward, that it's socially traditional and conservative. I mean, there was even an article, I think it was about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago in the National Post, highlighting the fact that in New Brunswick, the social conservative runs quite deep, and they were bringing out 2 points. One was abortion services, which is very, very restricted in this province. If a woman would like an abortion in this province, she needs to obtain the signature of 2 doctors that deem the service to be medically necessary, and then she is allowed to have an abortion at one of 2 hospitals in the province. That's a very, very severe restriction on that medical procedure. The only more stricter restriction out there or from a province is in PEI, where abortions are banned in PEI. A woman cannot get an abortion in PEI. So they term that very socially conservative in New Brunswick. The other item is that there was a flack last year about the fact that to celebrate Pride Week, a bunch of students wanted to raise the Pride flag at their public school, and the Premier banned it. Premier David Alward banned that from happening, and a couple of weeks later he said that, well, it was against the provincial flag policy, which was kind of a boondoggle on the one hand, because other flags have been flown on public buildings and public schools for other purposes. And so again, the newspaper article picked up that New Brunswick is socially conservative. I take issue with that for a number of reasons, and maybe it is on the one hand, okay, but we have had some protest parties in the province. We had the United Farmers way back in the 20s and 30s. I believe it was the 1920s. Not really did much of anything in there. The Liberal Party in the province in the 1970s kind of fell apart, and all of a sudden we had the Parti Acadien come up to represent the Acadian voice in the mid-70s. They only lasted a few elections and then kind of fizzled out. Never really got more than 3 to 4 or 5% support, so very small support. In the mid-1980s, when the Richard Hatfield Conservative government kind of imploded themselves, we had a new ultra-right-wing conservative government come into play, the Confederation of Regions Party, which was anti-bilingual, anti-French, kind of racist overtones to this party, really radical ultra-right-wing party. But due to financial struggles and leadership challenges, even though the party became the official opposition in the 1991 election, actually, it fizzled out as well shortly thereafter. So we do have protest parties, just not many of them overall. So that's number one. Number two is we had a gay premier, Richard Hatfield, from 1970 to 1987, 17 years premier of New Brunswick. He was not openly gay, however, it was very well known who his partner was and that he was gay. So, I mean, that's not socially conservative at all right there, I would argue, or make forth that argument in there. The other thing that I am just taking a peek at in here is patronage, and has been largely curtailed with government reforms in 1987 brought in by Frank McKenna and the Liberal Party. So I mean, that's been largely curtailed. And when you check studies about the political attitudes of New Brunswickers, there's studies, I'm talking about some studies by Joanna Everett here, and back in the early 2000s, she found that New Brunswickers are more progressive in their attitudes towards women, towards the LGBT, and towards, I've got one more item in here, towards abortion as well, than people that live in the prairie provinces in Canada. So again, that's an interesting piece of evidence there that together it's I don't think it's that socially conservative. So the question is, to me, is what gives? Right? If they're not, if you've got a camp in here that's almost at a stalemate, what gives? One says that they are socially conservatives, another says they're not. I just think it goes to the type of politics that is practiced in this province, and that goes back to red Toryism. If we recall red Toryism in here, you're talking about a branded conservatism here, Toryism in here, that believes in order, believes in tradition, stability, and they really have kind of a paternalistic attitude towards the working class overall. But what I'm talking about here is that they take a look at the working class and they feel that they have an obligation to help them out through providing some form of assistance, which is it's a very, very different brand of conservatism than what the current federal government is. So Peter MacKay would be a red Tory, for example. Bernard Valcor would be a red Tory as well within the current conservative government. There's not many of them, but they would be along the red Tory brand. If the red Toryism runs that deep, and I believe that it does, then what I would argue is that people would see it as legitimate and the norm to work through existing political institutions and structures to make changes. The only thing in doing this type of thing right here is the fact that this takes time. So basically what I'm arguing here is the fact that they don't go out to start new protest parties, or if they do, that's very, very rare. They rather work within existing structures and norms, which takes time to reconcile differences. More time than just going out there and marching in the street or to do some other more radical types of changes. I'm not saying it's better or worse right here. I'm just saying this is how their efforts at change are channeled overall. So that's kind of a subplot in there within that subservience in there. This is interesting in here overall because when you trace the history of the premiers or the recent premiers in New Brunswick, you get a very, very interesting dynamic in here. If we remember the French-English divide in here and that subservience in here, okay, Louis J. Robichaud, who was premier from 1960 to 1970 in New Brunswick, Acadian. And he came in and put in an equal opportunity program where services would be provided equally to French and English people, largely because in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, healthcare services were not provided equally, educational services were not provided equally, and neither were social services. Let me give you an example here. I have a number of relatives that live in New Brunswick, in northern New Brunswick, Acadians, and I know that from what they have told me is that they could not get education past grade 5 when they were growing up in the 50s and 60s. My uncles are quite an age now, said they couldn't go to school past grade 5 because they were French. They had to make a special application to the government in here or petition the government to allow them to continue to go to school in French or to provide the education. That's pretty significant in here when you're thinking about this in here. It's a basic right, education, and they can't have it. Same thing occurred for healthcare services, and a number of services just were not provided to the French population. Social services, same thing. So with Robichaud, when he came in 1960, he brought in his Equal Opportunity Program, where all New Brunswickers would be provided with equal services, whether that's education, whether that's healthcare, whether it's social services. And it was very, very controversial overall. I mean, all of a sudden you have this English majority, two-thirds majority here, arguing you're robbing Peter to pay Pierre. Right? I mean, but it's not robbing someone to pay another person. What you're doing is saying we're all equal people. We're providing an equal amount of services to the citizens of the province. So I mean, but very, very controversial for the time, and that was a critical election with Robichaud that came in. More interestingly, though, than that was the fact that successive premiers have continued with the reforms and maintained them. So when Robichaud lost to Richard Hatfield in 1970, the progressive conservative premier, he continued with the bilingual policy and with the equal opportunity programs policy right through the 1970s and into the 1980s overall in here. And this is significant because he's just further entrenching the equality of people. And this is very, very interesting for how this played out politically. Prior to the 1974, 75, you had the Acadians predominantly voting, or almost exclusively, for the Liberal Party. And everybody northwest, southwest of that line that I drew up on that map of New Brunswick on the PowerPoint, so the Anglophone population, they almost voted exclusively for the Progressive Conservative Party. So you had this great divide. But because of these changes by Robichaud, which was reinforced by Richard Hatfield, all of a sudden you start to see blurring of the lines, some English people voting for the Liberals and vice versa, French voting for the Progressive Conservatives over time. And so this is a huge change in here, to the point where the Conservatives elected their first Francophone premier and first Catholic premier as well in the province, in Bernard Lord, when he came in as premier in 1997. So it had a huge effect on the politics of the province right now. The other item that I want to mention in here is that it's kind of interesting in here within the electoral system, because Richard Hatfield was kind of preoccupied with the Constitution again, 1982, late 70s, going into the early 1980s and everything else. Very, very popular premier, but he fell largely out of favor by the mid-1980s. The economy was stagnant, and there was a rash of personal indiscretions, marijuana charges, allegations of distributing cocaine to students. Think about this here, these types of charges, and think about the charges that people make about New Brunswick being socially conservative. This doesn't jive, right? I mean, so you can really challenge that whole social conservatism type of lens in here. And so with the Progressive Conservative Party in shambles at that point, the Liberal Party in 1987 won the election. This is interesting, and for political science junkies out there, it's phenomenal, because the Liberal Party came in and won every single seat in the province. There were 58 seats, and the Frank McKenna Liberals won all 58 seats. They had no opposition when they went into the House. That was a first, actually. It happened a second time. One time, I think it was 1930s in PEI, but it's never happened since then. So that's very, very different in this process. And think about this. This is how our single-member plurality system in Canada perverts the vote choice. Frank McKenna and the Liberals in 1987 won all 58 seats with only 60% of the vote. So that means that 40% of the people that voted for the Progressive Conservatives and the NDP didn't get any sort of representation within the legislature. Interesting. About 20 years later, or 15 years later, to make sure this did not happen, when Bernard Lord came in as premier, he ordered a review of this for electoral reform. And think about this too in the social conservatism angle, because New Brunswick studied a mixed member plurality system, which reported in 2005, which was before British Columbia did theirs, which was before Ontario did their review of their electoral system as well. So again, how conservative are we really here in terms of social conservatism? I mean, we're kind of innovators in a way, and here's what I would argue in this process. Ultimately, we did reject the MMP system that was proposed. There was no political will to do it. I think the people would have gone further with it, but the political will just was not there. Now, let me fast forward a little bit to give you a little bit more of the current type of situation. with the current government. But just before I get there, I want to say that before the current government came into office, there was the Sean Graham Liberals, the only government in this province that had one term as a government, 4 years only. And they were largely brought down because they wanted to address the province's finances. But almost too quickly. They had plans to reform the education system, post-secondary education. They wanted to sell New Brunswick Hydro to Quebec, and that really, really fell out of favor, dramatically out of favor with the people, because you're almost selling out your sovereignty over your energy resources here. So in the next election in 2010, he lost that election handily to the Progressive Conservative Party overall. Finances play a big role in New Brunswick, and if you recall, a population of 750,000 people overall, we have about a $14 billion debt in this province. That's a billion. 14 billion, 750,000 population. If those numbers sound familiar, and they should here, you're not off, you're correct. The city of Detroit, Michigan, just declared bankruptcy in the past year. They had about 750,000 people, $18 billion of debt. The only thing preventing New Brunswick from declaring bankruptcy is the fact that we receive federal equalization and federal transfers. Remember that 40 cents of every dollar comes from the federal government. That's the only lifeline that's saving us from declaring bankruptcy right now. And so the finances are huge, and it's a huge, huge factor in this province. So we do need to address those. And this is where we get to the current Conservative government of David Alward. When they were elected in 2010, they took about 2 years before they could get a handle on the finances. The finances and the deficit spending just spiraled out of control. I remember in 2012, they started out with a budget forecast of 142 or 150 million dollar deficit for that year. A few months later, they said it was going to be 242, then 298, then 350, and by the time the year was out, it was like $498 million. They were playing Russian roulette with the deficit. They had no idea what was going on. So it took them roughly 3 years into their mandate to get a handle, and at least to their credit, in the last 6 months, they've gotten a handle on it, so they've spent within their means. They're still not they're still in a deficit position, but at least it's not growing to at the same rate as what it was previously. Which leads us to the election in September 2014, in 2 months' time, or I guess 1 month time, month and a half right now. The polls indicate that the Liberals in the province are ahead and have been ahead. The last poll, I believe, was around, got the poll numbers here in front of me, 53% of the people that responded were leaning towards the Liberals, would vote Liberal, 28% would vote Conservative, and 16% would vote for the NDP. That was done a couple of months ago by CRA out of Halifax. And those numbers have been fairly consistent for about 2 to 2.5 years right now, that the Liberals have had a huge lead. And so a question in there is why. You could argue, well, the Tories have mismanaged the New Brunswick economy. True, maybe. They sure have not helped themselves, that's for sure in there. You could argue that the Liberals have a new leader, and a young Liberal leader, 32 years old, Brian Gallant, quite dynamic leader. So that's attracting more interest and more people. True, could be. Could be the federal effect from the federal government, from the federal Liberals. Justin Trudeau, a huge effect from JT up there in Ottawa. True, that could be as well. So there's a number of factors in here pushing for change. So the winds of change are blowing. But the Liberal Party's not really responding to that change. They haven't really released any planks or any ideas of what they would do if they were in government. We have only a month and a half left, and nothing's really been set out there or anything else, which is significant here. And actually, none of the parties have really released anything. And so what we seem to have is a province, I would argue, that's kind of drifting right now, and there's a lack of leadership, I would argue, from each of our provincial political leaders in here from each party. And that's significant and troubling overall, because we're at a crossroads in here where we need some significant changes in how we structure things. And we don't have the leadership right now to really take us there. And I would even argue that if I was in opposition right now, I would really, really be careful what I wish. and I say this openly to you because would I want that job of coming in and having to slash things dramatically in order to try to get things back in order? That's very, very concerning to someone. It may be better to lose the election and let the current government, the Conservatives, continue to be unpopular and worsen things, and then come in, and then whatever your ideas are for restructuring, they'll be more readily accepted. Here's my last point here. One idea for restructuring that a lot of people have put forth, even 2 years ago, there was 3 senators, one from each of the maritime provinces. And I should clarify for you that when I talk about the Maritimes, or when people talk about Maritimes, we're talking about New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI. When we talk about Atlantic Canada, it's those 3 provinces and Newfoundland. So there's a distinction in there that needs to be made, so just as a clarification. There has been for some time a large push for maritime union. I mean, this is why we have Canada right now, because the original talks to what created what we know as Canada today was the 3 maritime provinces of PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick wanting to get together in the 1860s to talk about a maritime union. It just so happened that Quebec and Ontario hijacked the Charlottetown Conference and changed it into the Confederation, the details of which were finalized at the Quebec Conference a couple of months later in 1864. Now, so it's not a new idea. 2 years ago, the proposal got floated again by some senators, conservative senators. And the main argument that they made was the fact that, well, hey, there's going to be cost efficiencies, right? You've got very small population, you know, you're not going to eliminate duplication of services and everything else like that. So, I mean, it'll be better government, better representation. I don't buy that one iota, simply because Andy Sancton at the University of Western Ontario, when he studied municipal amalgamations at the City of Toronto back in the 2000s, and for the City of Halifax back in the 2000s as well, when Halifax, Dartmouth across the bay, and this Bedford at the end of the bay became the Halifax Regional Municipality, he found that there were no cost savings to amalgamating at all. There's no improved services, there's no cost savings at all. Here's why there's no cost savings. It's because, let's take the Halifax example. Take an electrician. You got an electrician in each of the 3 jurisdictions, and he may get paid $25 in one jurisdiction. The electrician may get paid in the second one $22, and the third one may get paid, say, $21. They don't tend, after amalgamation, to drive the wages down to the lowest, the one making the lowest wage. Rather, what they do is everyone gets moved up to whoever has the highest wage. So right there, you've eliminated potential cost savings. Second, you've also all of a sudden got more people. So it's like, oh, well, we need some more middle management to oversee these people. So you create new positions to manage people and to supervise people. So that takes away some of the merger savings as well. And then there's all the restructuring costs, building a new municipal infrastructure in terms of building, where do you put it, new stationery, like, it just goes on and on. And so when you take a look at the items, there's no cost savings there. So I don't see maritime union at all in there being a radical cost saving. And I would even argue that if you want some cost savings, there's nothing wrong with going to sharing of services across the existing provinces that exist right now. And indeed, there are over, I believe, 221 services that they participate with together to try to economize on costs. I mean, if the province of New Brunswick wanted to share in the purchasing of, say, hospital beds, there's nothing stopping the Premier of New Brunswick picking up the phone, calling Premier of Nova Scotia and saying, hey, we need to purchase 500 beds this year. You need to purchase how much? Can we get together in this purchase, and then we'll try to get a better price on them? There's nothing stopping them from doing that, whether it's for salt to put on the roads in the winter, hospital beds, as I just said, or any other type of service to be provided. So I think that that's just a non-seller right there. And I think more political cooperation, sure. And even in terms of a political culture and what you're going to mean to people overall, think about it. Maritime union is the same thing as someone saying, well, why don't we merge all the western provinces, the prairie provinces, and just call it, I don't know, Westernalia or something like that. the political culture of each region and the representation is very, very different, and they need to have their own expression as well. Do we have too many politicians? I would argue, sure, we do. I mean, in New Brunswick alone, we've gone from 58 in the 80s to 55 up until 2010. In September, they've, with the electoral redistribution, we've gone down to 49 now. I would hope that it would go down to 39 as the Commission on Electoral Reform reported in 2005 for the province. We're getting there slowly. I'd like to see it go faster. I do think we have too many, and I do think there are perhaps a few cost savings that can be had. The last thing I just want to add is that while we have governments in the regular exchange of power between the Liberals and the Conservatives in the province, whichever one wins is squarely backed by the Irvings and the McCains. If they need to win, you have to cater their favor, and their political contributions as well. So that they have to be on side for it here. So they again are always there. They're a really, really big force in the overall structure. So those are some items right there. I've kind of couched it in subservience, the English-French dynamic, economic interest both within the province and across Canada, political culture within this process. I touched a little bit on the recent election overall and maritime union. And I guess I'll stop there, and I just invite your questions overall.
Perfect. Thanks, Mario. And that you did cover a lot of ground and tied it up nicely. And actually, that is a good segue into some of the questions we've got on our blog at provincialpolitics.blogspot.ca. And the first question is, I mean, you spoke a little bit about the influence of the Irvings and McCains on economic policy and on political parties. Do they have any control over social policy at all? Could you maybe comment a bit on that?
The extent of what they have control over social policy is how much they want to dictate how much the government should invest in what areas. So, for example, in 2013, I think it was, 2013 when it came out, in May 2013, the Conservative government, the current government, came out and said, we're going to have a program that we will subsidize 50% of the wages of university graduates. So if a company in New Brunswick hired a recent university graduate, within 3 years someone has graduated, they would subsidize 50% of those wages. Now, that's great because the province sold it as, well, we want to keep our young people here instead of all moving out to Alberta and go work in the oil patch or something like that. So that'll stimulate local businesses to hire our own university graduates. Well, the very next week, Irving's came out and said, we're going to hire 3,500 people. And so, I mean, you can't tell me there's no similarity in there between the two in here. This was planned between them, no doubt. I don't have any tangible proof in here, but the similarities are too great to say that, this was there was communication there somehow between them, and that they did this with that in mind as well. And I should also add that the current finance minister of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, is actually used to work for Irving in the financial department and had one of the financial departments. I forget which one it was within the company. So, I mean, there's a direct pipeline there between the company and actually the province and the government directly. So he's well versed in what they know and what they want and how they want it to go, to have a small social state. So this is how they're driving the policy.
Now, is there a connection between this, again from our blog? Is there a connection between either the families and individual parties, or as you seem to suggest, is there do the two major families play those parties off one another?
The two families have infiltrated the main parties totally, without question, and they even do play them off. The answer to your question is both, actually. But they have infiltrated the parties totally, and they do play them off when they see fit. So, for example, the province introduced a new Crown Force strategy a few months ago. And we used to protect about 28% of our Crown Forest to maintain habitat for wildlife and rivers and streams and whatnot. The rate from what the natural scientists say is we should target 30%. We were at 28%. Well, the current government slashed that, I think, to 22% to give more wood to who? the pulp mills in the province and the pulp and paper mills and the sawmills. Who owns most of those? Irving. And so, I mean, that right there is pretty significant. Now, the reaction to that has been significant from the academic community and the public against them doing this overall. And even the NDP party came out and criticized it initially, but then were muted and said, well, we need more information to study it, until someone discovered that they had just gotten some donations from the Irvings. So you can see how the ties in here kind of mute any political opposition to it, and kind of you see the connections develop in there. So I mean, they're there, they're at the table, and they're driving the policy to make sure that they drive it to where they want it to go.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit, again, going from our blog, a good question about language politics. Given the fact that the Francophone population of New Brunswick experiences such a low level of healthcare and education compared to Anglophones, has there been any advocacy by Quebec on a federal level or on behalf of the Acadian population? What we're really getting at here is maybe a little bit of, from the outside looking in, one would think that that Quebec, being a big proponent of French language and in that province anyway, might come to the defense of Acadians in some kind of sense. That's not the way it works. I want to maybe just talk a little bit about maybe some of the tensions that exist between the Acadian population and the Quebecois.
That's a good question, actually, and I've got a multi-tiered answer for you in this process here. First off, the health services and education services and social services have improved for the Francophone population greatly since the 50s and 60s, since the Equal Opportunity Program was put in place. However, the bulk of all the vacancies within the hospital for heart surgeons or for specialists or anything else like that is in the Francophone system. They're severely understaffed, and so you have French people going to English doctors, and they're not served in their own native language. They got no idea what the doctor is saying to them, and so that creates a problem overall. You could also say, if I'm having a heart condition, do I really care what language they are as long as I get the best surgeon? I mean, they could be Chinese, who cares, as long as I get the best surgeon, right? So I mean, that's a good argument as well. But I mean, where a government is committed to providing services to its people and then it's their official languages, where numbers warrant, there's a disconnect there. Now, the Acadians and the Quebecois, they're not the same at all. Yes, they're French to outsiders. They don't speak to each other. They're not the same at all. The dialects are very, very different. In Canada, when you're taking a look at it, there's Quebec French. Like first, I guess overall, there's the epitome, Parisian French, if you want to call it. Then there's this lower tier, Quebec French. Then there's an even lower tier, Acadian French, is how the structure kind of suits in. So Quebec does not really advocate for the Acadians at all, from my perspective and from what I've seen at all. And actually, other than to say that here's what happens to a population when you don't fight hard for your own rights. They hold it up to Acadians as an example here of how they become diluted and become anglicized overall, and becomes assimilated, which is what Quebec is all trying to avoid overall. They don't want one to fall into that assimilation trap, which they see happening with the Acadian population. The dialogue simply is not there. I myself, for example, let me give you a personal example. I myself am Acadian, and when I go to Quebec, they want me to speak English because the dialect that I speak is not the same as theirs, and they don't accept it at all. And so they'd say it's not proper. And I've had that numerous times overall. So I'm no better than an English person coming from BC or Alberta going to Quebec. I'm just as much a foreigner to them as anybody else. Quebec is its own entity. Its own enclave. They don't try to mix. In New Brunswick, it's very different. So, for example, if you speak to somebody in the Acadian communities, if you go and some of the Anglophone communities, if you go and speak to someone in French, they'll respond in French. If you go speak to them in English, they'll respond in English, which is pretty good. The only exception to that is some of the pockets of pure English areas, and think in the extreme southwest area, St. Stephen, St. John, New Brunswick, that's where the Confederation or Regions Party took root, is in that area in there. They will not speak French to you at all there. It's going to be pure English overall. Likewise, some Acadian communities in the northeast, Tracadie area in particular, will not speak any English to you at all. They'll look at you and they won't respond to you because you're in the French region. So, I mean, you still have that big tension between them in there. But as far as the Acadians and Quebecois, there's no connection there. Very, other than they're both French, but they're just tolerant of each other, but there's no dialogue.
It's like Manitobans and people from Saskatchewan, really. I'm kidding.
It could be. I don't know enough on that one.
Well, thanks, Mario, for taking the time out this evening. We covered a lot of ground, but you did it in such a concise and insightful way. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody here has got a better understanding of New Brunswick politics as a result. So thanks very much.
You're quite welcome. If anyone ever has any question, you can look me up on the Mount Allison website under the Politics and IR department. And thank you.
Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.